Hi everyone. So in this video, we're going to start diving into some of the reasoning about the philosophy of religion that comes up in John Perry's dialogue on good, evil, and the existence of God. So we're going to focus on what's called the logical problem of evil. So in this video, we're going to just review what traditional theism is. We'll give some examples of evil and suffering. Then we'll talk about two problems of evil that are commonly distinguished in today's sort of philosophical literature. There's the logical problem, and then there's the evidential problem. As I said, our focus will be on the logical problem, and we'll use that to explain a logical argument from evil. So previously we introduced three views. Theism, which is the belief that there exists a personal God or gods. Atheism, the belief that God does not exist. And agnosticism, which is just a psychological state of withholding belief about God's existence or non-existence. So you remain neutral. You just don't have a belief one way or the other. This is analogous to if you say, Sam, what do you think about the claim that there's an even number of stars in the universe? Well, if you ask me, I'll say, I don't believe that. But I also don't believe that it's not true. So I don't believe that there are an even number of stars. But I also don't believe that there aren't an even number of stars. I just remain neutral about that claim. I withhold belief altogether. All right, so when we look at theism here, you might sort of ask, well, is theism rational to believe? Because sometimes people believe irrational things. So what kind of evidence could someone give to try to show that this belief that there exists a personal God or gods is likely to be true? Now, we saw an argument from Craig, the Kalam cosmological argument, that tries to argue, look, one reason that makes it rational to believe in God is this idea that we need God to explain where the universe came from, because you can't get something from nothing. And then we looked at the problems with that kind of argument as well. And then we looked at Paley's argument that tries to argue, but look, when we look at the kind of universe we live in, there's a whole lot of design in the universe. And to explain where that design came from, we need to posit a designer who had a desire to create things that could fulfill those functions and had the knowledge of how to arrange all the pieces so as to allow them to complete that function. Yet again, we saw the problems with that argument as well. But this is one thing I want to point out. That doesn't necessarily support atheism, because to point out problems with arguments for God's existence is not to argue that God doesn't exist. So even if an argument fails, that doesn't mean that its conclusion is false. People can give problematic arguments for true conclusions. It also doesn't mean that the belief in God is irrational, because even if those arguments fail to show that the belief in the conclusion is rational, maybe there's other arguments, or maybe there's ways to fix those arguments. And so we can't conclude from the fact that there are worries with those arguments or objections. And we can't conclude that even if those arguments fail, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's rational to reject the belief in God. And so we might ask, well, why should we believe atheism? Is that a rational belief? Can you give evidence that would make that belief likely to be true? And that's what we're going to start to do, is look at an argument that not only doesn't just try to show that arguments for God's existence fail, but tries to give its own positive argument that gives evidence that tries to make it rational to believe the conclusion that there is not a God. At least in the sense of traditional theism. So the problem we're going to look at is specifically an argument against a one kind of God. And remember, this is the belief in the existence of exactly one God that is responsible for creating the universe and everything in it, including human beings. And this God has the features of omnipotence, being all-powerful, omniscience, being all-knowing, and omnibenevolence, being all good or morally perfect. So the problem we're going to look at is essentially trying to argue that this kind of God does not exist. So if this argument succeeds, that doesn't mean that there isn't any kind of God. It just means that this kind of God that is sort of believed by a number of religions doesn't exist. Yet again, if it succeeds. So one thing that's painful obvious to all humans, so whether you're a theist, an atheist, or an agnostic, is that there is an abundance of evil or suffering that we see in this world. So there's many examples of evil or suffering. There's big and small, both today and throughout history. So here's a whole lot of examples. Rape, murder, genocide, cancer, COVID-19, bullying, animal cruelty, physical, mental, and economic suffering caused by tornadoes, malaria, theft, homelessness, child abuse, the flu, racism, sexism, innocent children dying of starvation. This is just a small list of all the really sort of evil and terrible things that exist throughout history. And notice there's a lot of different kinds of evils here. Some of them are big, some of them are small, some of them occur in different forms than others. But all of them are suffering in some form. Now, there's a long history of thinkers who have suggested that this obvious fact that there's evil in the world makes it rational to be an atheist, or at the very least, agnostic. So the idea is that the existence of evil sort of poses an apparent problem for anyone who believes in God, at least as traditionally conceived. Now, interestingly enough, I want to stress there's a number of religious thinkers that have taken this problem very seriously. And one of the reasons they do so is they think it is a serious problem, and in order to rationally believe their religion, they thought they needed to deal with that problem. And they didn't think it was easy to do. Moreover, they thought by trying to figure out how to solve this problem, they would thereby learn something about their religion, about sort of God and our relation to God. So this problem is important to consider not just as an atheist, but also as a theist, because it can help clear up your own thinking. So over the past 50 years, though, philosophers have distinguished two ways that evil might challenge a belief in God. The first is what's called the logical problem. And this is the claim that the existence of evil makes it irrational to believe in God because God's existence is literally inconsistent with the existence of evil. So the idea here is believing that God exists and believing that sort of evil exists is irrational because there's a logical problem. Those two beliefs just can't both be true. It'd be like someone who believes that Bob is a bachelor, but also believes that Bob is married. So there's a logical problem with those beliefs. Those beliefs are inconsistent. Someone can't be both a bachelor and married. Those beliefs just can't go together. And so it'd be irrational for someone to believe that Bob is a married bachelor. Similarly, the logical problem says that belief in God and evil is like this. The evidential problem makes a weaker claim. And by weaker, I don't necessarily mean less plausible. I just mean they're not making as bold of a claim. This is the claim that the existence of evil makes it irrational to believe in God, not because God and evil are necessarily inconsistent with one another, but rather because the kinds of evil we see in our world provides evidence that makes God's existence unlikely. The idea here is that a world with God, would not be likely to see the kinds of evils we actually see, even if there's no logical inconsistency. So, how might someone reconstruct the logical problem of evil into an argument for atheism? Well, here's the idea, in a simple form. If God, as traditionally conceived, exists, then evil would not exist. So, it's impossible for both God and evil to exist at the same time. That's what this premise says. It says that these two beliefs can't go together. There's a logical problem. But clearly, evil does exist. Therefore, God does not exist. So, premise 2 seems to be on solid ground. Remember that list of all the evil and suffering we've seen in this world. So, to support this argument, one must explain, if an atheist wants to defend this argument to try to show that it's rational to believe that God doesn't exist, well, they need to explain how God, as traditionally conceived, is inconsistent with the existence of evil. So Gretchen Weirob from our dialogue represents an atheist supporting this kind of reasoning. So consider the following passage from Gretchen Weirob. Okay, try hard to overcome your emotional commitment to your religion and just look at it as a straightforward, logical, philosophical proposition. So what she's saying here is, look, I don't want you to sort of think about how believing in God makes you feel good or how it makes you feel better about the world. I don't want you to think about your emotional commitment, your desire for there to be a God. Say, detach from that and look at it purely in this sort of logical fashion. So you believe in a God that's perfect in every way, all-knowing, all-powerful, and benevolent. So she's sort of sketching out this traditional theistic conception of God, and this is her target. So that's what it says in some of the creeds I had to learn as a child, words that are etched in my brain. But how can this be? If your God exists, he knows that I have the flu because he knows everything. He can certainly make it the case that I ceased to have the flu or could have prevented me from having the flu in the first place, for he's all-powerful. But I do have the flu. What am I to conclude? He must not care. But shouldn't a really benevolent God care about even a wretch like me? Why would he want me to suffer? So that is God's goodness there would mean that a good person doesn't want another person to suffer, does not desire for that bad outcome. But if God doesn't want me to suffer, why am I suffering? It is, if I accept your Christian premise that this world and all that is in it is the creation of a perfect God, I must draw the conclusion that I am not suffering. But clearly I am suffering. I'm experiencing this suffering. And so I reject the premise. There is no being that meets your definition of God. Perhaps there is no God, or perhaps there is, but he is ignorant or weak or mean. So in that last sentence, she's showing that she's not challenging a belief in just any God. She's specifically challenging belief in that traditional theistic conception of God, one that has those three features. They play a very important role in generating the logical problem that she sees. So we can turn Weirob's reasoning there into a more sort of developed reconstruction of the logical argument from evil, one that sort of takes that first premise and spells it out in greater detail so as to connect the dots. So notice in that passage, what she did is she said, look, I have this idea of God as a perfect being, an all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good being. And then she tries to connect those features up and say how they're connected to ideas of evil and the prevention of evil. So the argument goes as follows. If God exists, then God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, at least when we're talking about that traditional definition of God. Now, if God is omniscient, take one of those three, then God would know about any evil before it happens. If God is omnipotent, then God has the power to prevent any evil. And if God is all good, all omnibenevolent, then God doesn't want any evil to occur. So good people don't want bad things to happen. So if God knows about any evil, has the power to prevent it, and also doesn't want that evil to occur, then no evil would exist, because God would have stopped it, because God could have, God would want to, and God would know that it's about to happen. But evil does exist. Therefore, God, at least as traditionally conceived, does not exist. That's the developed form of the logical argument from evil. So that's all we're going to look at in this video. During our next video, we're going to start talking about potential responses a theist might give to this kind of argument, how they might try to avoid the conclusion. So I'll see you then. Bye-bye.